Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our Bible study this morning. We're going to be in Ezekiel. We're going to study chapter 40 through 42. We're going to cover 3 chapters today. You'll understand why when we get into it. But it's about what's been called Ezekiel's temple, or the Millennial temple, the temple that will be used for worship during the millennial reign of Christ, a 1,000-year reign. Okay, a sanctuary for worship was associated with Israel from the foundation of its existence. They had the tabernacle constructed in the wilderness. The dimensions were given exactly by God. All of the temple utensils were defined. The Ark of the Covenant was defined. Even all of the priestly garments were defined. God is very intentional. He doesn't leave anything up to chance. He knows how he wants things, and he defines them in Scripture. The tabernacle was originally totally portable. It's always been totally portable. It was huge, and it was transported everywhere they went in their wandering. All during that 40 years, they whenever they would move around, they would pick it up and take it with them. In fact, we studied a little bit about that when we studied about the perishing of Korah, I believe was the name of the video that we used. And Korah and his family was the group that was designated by God through Moses to transport all of the temple or the tabernacle holy things, the Ark of the Covenant and all the other things. And he didn't really like that job. He thought it was beneath him. He thought he ought to be prophet and priest and all that. But nevertheless, he ended up perishing at the end of that video, at the end of that section of Scripture. But nevertheless, even the jobs associated with the temples and the tabernacles were defined by God. Okay, they had 13 other worship centers, which were either explicitly designated by God, or they were implicitly designated. I want to read them to you so you'll know how many what they were. Okay, these were the indirectly designated as worship places, and they were, let me list them off for you. There were Shiloh, Dan, and Bethel. Have you ever heard of these places? Dan and Bethel were the 2 places where, when the northern kingdom went into spiritual apostasy and just separated from Israel altogether, they had a golden calf put in each one of those places. But nevertheless, this is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about before that time. So there was Shiloh, there was Dan and Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, Hebron, Bethlehem, Nob, the house of Micah, Ophrah, Gibeah, Arad, and Jerusalem. Those were all places where they've had places of worship set up. Then there were several temples that have been used. The first one was Solomon's temple. You remember David was the one that really wanted to build the temple, and God said, "No, I'll let you buy the land for it, but your son is the one to build it." So Solomon built his temple, and they worshiped in Solomon's temple until Babylon came along, and well, you all know what happened. They destroyed the temple, and then they went into exile. And then when the Medes and the Persians took over, they were released to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And they got that started, and then this rebuilt temple is called Zerubbabel's temple. If you remember that, we talked about Zerubbabel when we studied Haggai. And then there was Herod's temple, and Herod's temple is the one that he took over that Zerubbabel's temple and expanded on it, and it seemed like a lifelong building project that didn't end until 70 A.D. when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and that was the temple that Jesus worshipped in. Okay, then we have the present temple. Did you know there is a temple? That temple is the hearts of believers. Okay, don't want to count that one. It's clear in the Bible that is existence, in existence, and that is where the temple is, where we worship God. The next temple will be the temple of Revelation 2. We might call that the tribulation temple. That's a temple that is not in existence right now, but will be built. The animal sacrifices will start. Antichrist will end up desecrating that temple, and I assume it's going to be torn down because there's going to be a new one built. And that new one that's going to be built is the one we're going to talk about today. We're calling it Ezekiel's temple, or the Millennial temple, and that's the one that's going to be built for worship during the millennium. And then there will be one more, and that'll be the last one, and that's the eternal temple. That's the one that's spoken of at the end of Revelation, where we'll worship God, where there is no daylight. No darkness, only daylight, and so on and so forth. So those are the various places of worship that they're spoken of in the Bible. Like I said, the one we want to talk about today is the Millennial Temple. So let's get right on into it. Chapter 40, verses 1 through 4 is where we'll start. So let me read verses 1 and 2. In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on that 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the fall of the city, on that very day the hand of the Lord was on me, and he took me there. In visions of God, he took me to the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain, on whose south side were some buildings that looked like a city. Well, we're going to see that what he saw that looked like a city was a temple complex, and that's how big it was. It looked like a city from a distance. It's so big. Okay, so there's two measures here. There's the 25th year of exile on the 10th of the month, and the second one is the 14th year following the fall of Jerusalem. In a vision, he doesn't physically go there, but he's in a vision. Remember, we talked about Ezekiel being in, when the book starts, he tells us he's on the banks of the Kibar River in Babylon among the captives. So he writes this whole, records this whole book of it that we call Ezekiel through visions while he was in captivity. Okay. Commentators make an interesting observation about that 25. The first measure was the 25 years since exile. So there are 25. They've been in captivity for 25 years, and he points out that the captives are halfway to the next year of Jubilee. Have you heard of that? Jubilee is a I don't know what you call it, a holiday or an observance that occurs every 50 years. For these groups, this is a symbolic measure because they're in captivity and this is not going to be able to happen, but it's an encouragement for them to know that the year of Jubilee is coming. And the reason is, it happens on the Day of Atonement, on the 10th of the month. Every 50th year, trumpets were blown to announce an especially holy year. Once every 50 years is what we're talking about. Land is bought and sold in the prior intervening periods were returned to its original owners. So those who had lost their land and had been reduced to a slave status might be able to return to their ancestral heritage, because things kind of go in reverse there on every 50th year. It's not too hard to see that the encouragement that these who would have lost land and become enslaved would draw from this announcement. They're sitting there in captivity thinking, 25 more years, maybe things are going to go backwards and I'm going to get my land back. But for me, I read right past this. I didn't think 1 second did I think about the year of Jubilee when I read through there and saw 25 years. Not one time did I think 25 years into the future thinking of the year of Jubilee. The reason is that I'm not a Jewish slave. I'm not any kind of slave, and I'm not Jewish. So those kinds of things I don't really think about, and you probably don't either. But nevertheless, if you were in captivity as a Jew, you probably would be thinking about those things as it came up. In verse 2, the vision, he is transported to a very high mountain overlooking what looked like a city. And what we're going to see as we go through here is that what he saw was the new temple, the Millennial temple, Ezekiel's temple. The high mountain has always played a role in Israelite history. Moses got his design of the tabernacle on Mount Sinai. What else did he get on Mount Sinai? He got the 10 Commandments. Ezekiel is also shown a heavenly sanctuary, and he is instructed about requirements for worship, which make him the only man besides Moses to impart God's law to the people. This is a very big deal. Okay, let's look at verse 3. He gets the law. He's going to get the design for the temple. He's going to get what they're going to do in the temple, how they're going to worship in the temple. He's going to get all that, and he's going to impart that to the people. It's only one person that's been able to do that in the past. That was Moses. All right, let's look at verse 3. He took me there to that high mountain, and I saw a man whose appearance was like bronze. He was standing in the gateway with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand. Okay, he sees a man like bronze with measuring equipment. So right away, you see that we're going to be about measuring things and designing things. So you'll see that you will be able to see that we'll be talking about the measurements of the Millennial Temple and related matters. All right, verse 4. The man said to me, Son of man, look carefully and listen closely and pay attention. This sounds like you're talking to a high school boy. He says, Son of man, look carefully and listen closely and pay attention to everything I'm going to show you, for that is why you have been brought here. Tell the people of Israel everything you see. So you better be paying attention. See and hear and pay attention. Really listen to what the man has to say. And why is that? Let me tell you again. Because that is why you have been brought here. Pay attention. It's like it's an instructional video, but not a video at all. Okay, we're going to see a unit of measure is a cubit, a long cubit, and that's about a ½ meter. I think footnote of my Bible says it's about 21 inches. one rod. We're going to see as we read through here. We may see it as we read. We're going to see a measuring of a rod, which is 6 cubits, which is about 3 meters, 13.5 feet actually. And these chapters, as you get into this, you're going to understand what I'm getting ready to tell you. These chapters are full of measurements of the Millennial Temple and its courts, the temple and the courts that surround it. To many, to really discuss, there's too many to really read and derive any meaning from it except for size. The important thing to note and remember is that God, you're going to look at this and say, oh man, snooze time. These 3 chapters are full of measurements. And I'm not kidding, I'm not exaggerating. The important thing to note, though, is to remember that God specified these measurements, so they are important. He didn't leave it up to Ezekiel. He didn't leave it up to the guys that are actually going to build this temple whenever that happens. He says, this is what I want. I want it to be built this way, to this size, to these measurements, and don't deviate from it. God, otherwise you end up what? You're disobedient. God specifies what he wants, and that's what we're to do. God is instructional, intentional, he is specific, and he is particular. These are heavenly measurements, just like those of the tabernacle that they transported all around. God said, this is what I want you to do with that big tent. This is how I want it to look. This is the size I want it to be. And you're going to have to carry it around everywhere you go. He said, don't change it in any way. That's what it was all about for the tabernacle. It's been that way for every temple, and it's going to be that way for this temple as well. All right. That brings us to verse 5. Now, ordinarily what we've done is read every verse. When we study, we do a verse-by-verse study. There's way too much stuff here to do verse by verse and derive any meaningful meaning from it other than to understand the sizes and proportions of the things that we're going to be talking about. But I want to look at verse 5. Verse 5. And we'll see where we go from there. Verse 5, it says, I saw a wall completely surrounding the temple area. Not the temple, but the temple area. The length of the measuring rod in the man's hand was 6 long cubits, each of which was a cubit and a handbreadth. That's a width of your hand. He measured the wall. It was 1 measuring rod thick and 1 rod high. So it's a wall 13 feet wide, 13 feet tall. Okay, right away, you see the word cubit. The word cubit is used all the way through here when it talks about the gates, when it talks about the inner courts, when it talks about the rooms, the temple, and everything else. It uses either rods or cubits, and you're continually having to do conversions in your head to determine what are the sizes that we're talking about. Well, I think that could be a huge distraction. It will take forever to get through it if I do that. But I want you to be aware that this is what we're going to be looking at, measurements. Okay, if we go to, let's see, I want to talk about walls for just a second. We talked about the wall there around the temple area. Walls are sometimes used for protection. Remember, God saw a city without walls because the people were living in safety and they didn't need walls. Well, there is a wall here around the temple area, around the entire temple complex. There are walls, but those are not for protection from enemies. They are for protection from the outside world, from what's the word, from being profaned, because we're talking about a holy area. And you can't just kind of like, if people are going through there on vacation, you can't just allow them to kind of meander through the temple and look around and, touch things and all that. This is a holy area. The walls are there to be used for protection, to keep things holy and clean, and that sort of thing. It's not, the walls are not there necessarily for to keep marauders out, mercenaries and warriors, that sort of thing. Okay, so we get to it talks about the outer court, the east gate. Okay, there's 3 gates. Starting with verse 6, it goes into the discussion about the east gate. Let's look at that for just a second. Not all of it, but he said, there he went to the east gate. He climbed its steps and measured the threshold of the gate. It was 1 rod deep. The alcoves for the guards were 1 rod long and 1 rod wide. And the projecting walls beneath the alcoves were 5 cubits thick, and the threshold of the gate next to the portico facing the temple was 1 rod deep. Then he goes into measuring the porticos and all of the various things that have to do with the gate. And what's important to realize is that if you have a wall that is too thick to knock down, and it's too thick to climb over, then for protection, the next most important thing is the gate. If you can't get over the wall, you got to get through the gate, and so the gate needs to be substantial. We get a very picture of a substantial gate when we read through there, reading about the east gate. Now the thing is, if you go on and read, starting in verse 20, you start talking about the north gate, and then it goes on to the south gate in verse 24. And so you end up with 3 gates. There's the east gate, the north gate, and the south gates, and they're all alike. Except there's 1 gate, I think, that has 7 steps involved in it for some reason, in some way. So then in verse 17 to 19, there is discussion about the outer court. That's the court that surrounds the immediate temple and the priestly areas, which we'll look at in a few minutes. Okay, there's a big paved area, and there are 30 rooms for worshipers, which we would read through there. It's, let me go on to the inner gates in verse 28 to 37. 28 to 37, the gates to the inner court. Okay, you have the main area around the temple complex. Then there's a paved area. There's 30 rooms for worshipers on the outside perimeter of that wall. Then the inside of that is a paved area for walking, and then you go to the outer court, which is the large area for standing. I suppose you can stand there for worship and that sort of thing. And then you keep going in, and you get to where the temple is, and where you have the temple. There's 3 gates that go up to the temple, and there's this around the temple are all the priestly areas. I think we're going to see that as we come to it. But you're continually have elevation changes. You start. You had the 3 gates to the temple complex, which is the east, the north, and the south gates. They all had 7 steps leading up. You're on the outside of the temple complex. To get in, you go up steps. Then you have this area with the outer court, the paved walkway, and that sort of thing. Then you get to the temple area. there's 3 more gates that go up to where the altar is in the temple. But there's 3 more gates with 7 steps. Okay. 28 to 37 talks about the gates to the inner court. The inner court is the area immediately in front of the temple, and it has an altar there for sacrifices. 28 to 37, it's a lot of reading, but it gives the measurements of, again, it gives you the measurements of that area, the outer court. 28 says, let me read for a little bit of it. It says, then he brought me into the inner court through the south gate, and he measured the south gate. It had the same measurements as the others. Its alcoves, its projecting walls, and its portico had the same measurements as the others. The gateway and its portico had openings all around. It was 50 cubits long and 25 cubits wide. The porticos of the gateways around the inner court were 25 cubits. You see, you get into this measuring thing, and it gets to where it's very difficult to envision. But nevertheless, that's where the inner court is. Okay. Then there's rooms for, let's see, don't let me get ahead of myself. Yeah, this is something I want to read about because I think this is the thing that will confuse you more than anything else, is to talk about sacrifices. We're going to be having, why would you need sacrifices if you have the one that made the permanent substitutionary sacrifice for all believers, Jesus Christ, will be right there. So why are you going to need sacrifices? We have a whole video about that, which I will put the link to on the screen of this video. You'll be able to click on it to go right to it. It talks about the reasons for law and sacrifice in the millennium. I think you'll find it interesting. A lot of it comes from Hebrews. But if we look at the verses 38, starting 40 verse 38, these are rooms for preparing sacrifices. Now, if you have any doubt that this is talking about sacrifice, animal sacrifice, this will alleviate any of those doubts. This is very specific, and I want you to understand. I want you to see that it's here. I don't want to just tell you and then move on. I want you to see it with your very own eyes. It's in chapter 40, verse 38 and following. A room with the doorway was by the portico, in each of the inner gateways where the burnt offerings were washed. So there were burnt offerings, and they're going to be washed there. In the portico of the gateway were 2 tables on each side, on which the burnt offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings were slaughtered. Sounds like something living, breathing is going to be slaughtered to me. By the outside wall of the portico of the gateway, near the steps of the entrance of the north gateway, were 2 tables, and on the other side of the steps were 2 tables. So there were 4 tables on one side of the gateway and 4 on the other, 8 tables in all, on which the sacrifices were slaughtered. There were also 4 tables of dressed stone for the burnt offerings, each a cubit and a half long and a cubit and a half wide and a cubit high. On them were placed the utensils for slaughtering the burnt offerings and the other sacrifices, and double-pronged hooks, each a handbreadth long, were attached to the wall all around. The tables were for the flesh of the offerings. Okay, so there's rooms for preparing the sacrifices. There's no doubt about it. We're talking about the Millennial Temple. There will be sacrifices, animal sacrifices. If we look at verses 40 to 47, there's no doubt about there being a priestly element to this. Look at verse 40 through chapter 40, verses 44 through 47. Outside the inner gate, within the inner court, I don't expect you to be able to picture this because we've already mentioned 6 gates and all kinds of porticos, all kinds of steps, all kinds of this and all kinds of that. There's no way to keep it straight in your mind. But let's look at about rooms for the priest. Starts in verse 44 of chapter 40. Outside the inner gate, within the inner court, were 2 rooms, one on the side of the north gate and facing south, and the other on the side of the south gate and facing north. He said to me, the room facing south is for the priests who guard the temple, and the room facing north is for the priests who guard the altar. These are the sons of Zadok, who are the only Levites who may draw near to the Lord to minister before him. Then he measured the court. It was square, 100 cubits long and 100 cubits wide, and the altar was in front of the temple. So you go up these steps of this gate. There's what's called the inner court, and in the middle of that is an altar. You got priests that guard that, and you've got priests that guard the temple, I believe it was. So the priests are there. They're doing sacrifices. They also have duties of protecting holy things. There's an outer sanctuary. Let's see what I want to do. Chapter 40 verses 48 through 49 is about the temple. Yeah, let's look at that. 48 through 49. He brought me to the portico of the temple and measured the jambs of the portico. They were 5 cubits wide on either side. The width of the entrance was 14 cubits, and its projected walls were 3 cubits wide on either side. In 49, the portico was 20 cubits wide and 12 cubits from front to back. It was reached by a flight of stairs. This is important to just make a quick comment about. It was reached by a flight of stairs, and there were pillars on each side of the jambs. We started outside the temple complex. We went upstairs. There were 3 gates. Each of them had stairs that take us up to another level of the temple complex. And it's a walkway, and inside that walkway is it's called the outer court, the court outside of the temple. And then there are 3 more elevation changes that lead up to the inner court where the altar is. So we start at ground level, we go up a level to get into the temple complex, then you go up another level to get into the inner court. So we're continually doing elevation changes. Then there's another set of stairs that go into the temple area, into the temple. So that's another elevation change. I think what's important to realize that worship of God is always ascending. Our worship is always ascending, never descending. It's always ascending. We go up to meet God. Okay, so that's one of the things I'd just like to comment on about that. The outer sanctuary is the area around the Holy of Holies. In chapter 41, verses 1 and 2 talks about that. The entrance the man brought me to the main hall and measured the jambs, the width of the jambs, the entrance to the area. He also measured the main hall. It was 40 cubits, so on and so forth. Then in verse 3, he goes into the inner sanctuary. The inner sanctuary is the temple itself. Let me read verse 3 and 4. Then he went into the inner sanctuary and measured the jambs and entrance. Each was 2 cubits wide. So, the entrance was 6 cubits wide, and the projecting walls on each side of it were 7 cubits wide. Do you see why we didn't read all this? It's all these measurements. If you could draw it out, you might, if you really wanted to put your mind to it and try to imagine all this stuff, you could. that there are videos that you can search for that are animated that take you through this entire 3-chapter area, showing you every detail of what's in this book. I'll try to remember to put the link in the comment section for you to find that video. And he measured the length of the inner sanctuary. It was 20 cubits, and its width was 20 cubits, so it was square across the end of the main hall. He said to me, "This is the most holy place." That would be the holy place, Holy of Holies. And the temple area itself, well, it says it's the Holy of Holies, so yeah, Holy of Holies. Then there's some side rooms in verses 9 and 10. And these side rooms are they're just outer rooms, but they're associated with the priest in some way. And then there's a building. This is interesting. They just mentions a building in chapter 41, verses 12 through 14. It reads out the size of it, but nobody knows what it's for. We don't know what the purpose is. It's not given here, but it may have been there to protect the temple, more of an area of protection to keep the temple from being profaned. Then verses 13 and 14 is about the temple itself, chapter 41, verse 13 and 14. Then he measured, this might be worth talking about for a second. Then he measured the temple. It was 100 cubits long, and the temple courtyard and the building with its walls were also 100 cubits. Or I think it said in my Bible footnote that a cubit was 21 inches, about 21 inches. So 100 cubits would be 2,100 inches. We'll just call that 2,100 inches. I'll do some math for you. .2,100 inches is 175 feet. So I've already lost my place here. That was the temple, the size of the temple. It was 150 by, I think, 150. Yeah, so it's a square area is 150 by 150 roughly, or whatever I said that area was. Then the outer sanctuary is listed in 15 to 20. The outer sanctuary, let me see what that says, 21 to 26. Yeah, we'll just look at that for a second. The main hall had a rectangular door frame, and the one at the front of the most holy place was similar. There was a wooden altar 3 cubits high and 2 cubits square. Its corners, its base, and its sides were of wood. The man said to me, "This is the table that is before the Lord." Before the main hall and the most holy place had double doors. Each door had 2 leaves, and so on and so forth. On the doors of the main hall were carved cherubim and palm trees like those carved on the walls, and it had already talked about that earlier. And there was a wooden overhang on the front of the portico. On the side walls of the portico were narrow windows with palm trees carved on each side, and the side rooms of the temple also had overhangs. All right, so the altar of wood was the table, and there was a table that is before the Lord, and that is the table where the bread of presence was laid, which is where David came in one day to the temple or to the sanctuary. Is so hungry he ate the bread that was on that table. He sinned as a result of that. So that's mentioned it to be there. Okay, we're coming down to chapter 42 now, and we're going to be talking about rooms for the priestly element that's going to be involved in this. Chapter 42, verses 1 through 3. Then the man led me northward into the outer court and brought me to the rooms opposite the temple courtyard and opposite the outer wall on the north side. The building, whose door faced north, was 100 cubits long and 50 cubits wide, both in the section 20 cubits from the inner court, and in the section opposite the pavement of the outer court gallery at the 3 levels. So anyway, we're talking about these rooms for the priests they're up against the west wall of the temple complex, but they're in the inner sanctum, the inner court where the temple is, and that sort of thing. But they're the rooms for the priest. It's where the priests lived, where they ate, and that sort of thing. We read verses 10 through 12. I've got a note here in my Bible. Let's see if I can figure out what it is. On the south side, along the length of the wall of the outer court, adjoining the temple courtyard and opposite the outer wall, were rooms with a passageway in front of them. These were like the rooms on the north. They had the same length and width, with similar exits and dimensions. Similar to the doorways on the north were the doorways of the rooms on the south. There was a doorway at the beginning of the passage that was parallel to the corresponding wall, extending eastward, by which one enters the rooms. And in verse 13, he says, Then he said to me, the north and the south rooms facing the temple courtyard, those rooms he just talked about, are the priest's rooms, where the priests who approach the Lord will eat the most holy offerings. They will put the most holy offerings, the grain offerings, the sin offerings, and the guilt offerings, for the place is holy. Once the priests enter the precincts, they are not to go. All right, listen to this. Once the priests enter the holy precincts, they are not to go into the outer court until they leave behind the garments in which they minister, for these are holy. So they go in, they put on their special priestly garments. Whenever they leave there to go out into the outer court is where the people are. They can't be wearing the priestly garments there. They have to leave them inside because the Bible says they're holy. Okay, they put on other clothes before they go near the places that are for the people. Well, nothing else there I want to mention, I don't think. But mentioning that in the rooms is where they eat the holy sacrifices. Whenever these offerings are made, a certain portion of it is kept out for the priest. That's not just here, but even in the other temples that have gone before, the priests were told to eat part of the sacrifice. It was kept for them. And what I have in my notes here is that I said since the consumption, there's a responsibility here for the priest. Since the consumption of the sin offering was the required way required by the law of disposing of the low-grade contaminated material produced by the purification process. The process they go through in preparing these sacrifices cooking cooking the meat and that sort of thing is considered to be a low-grade contamination brought on by sin. And this was the prescribed way to get rid of the meat, let them eat it. Okay, the carcass of the animal was regarded as having absorbed impurities during the sacrificial ritual, which were then dealt with by being ingested by the priest. In other words, it was taking on the sin of the people. Okay. All right, well, that's really all I have for you today. And it's very difficult to study something like this because the only reason you want to read something like this if you are really interested in how the temple is going to be. But it really takes a lot of work to get all that information out of there. And I found that it was a lot easier to find the animated video that I was talking about that just kind of walks you through the whole area, through the gates at the very outer wall of the temple complex. And it takes through all of these rooms, all of these walkways, wherever detail was given about the palm trees, that sort of thing. All of that is shown in the video. But nevertheless, this is a description of the Millennial Temple. What I want you to get out of it is this: law and sacrifice is going to be practiced in the temple. Now, as I told you, I have a video that I've actually already put out. It's been out there quite a while. I put it out there a long time ago, not as part of our study as Ezekiel, just as a video to put out just for general purposes. But I'm going to point you to it so you can listen to it again. But the reasons, I'll be talking about the reasons for the need for sacrifice in the new temple. All right. I want to thank you for studying with me today. That's all I have for you. Thank you very much.